Hi. So I, 27, female, got married to my boyfriend of 7 years last week. My boyfriend, Jake, 28, male, and I got together in college, got a job at the same company, and then moved in together and have stayed together since. Both of us went to college out of state, so for the first couple of years we traveled back home to see our families every couple of weeks. Sometimes they'd come to visit us, and while my family only consisted of me and my parents, he had three siblings. He had two older brothers, Jared, 30, male, and Alex, 32, male, and a younger sister, Kelly, 23, female. His parents had always been nice to me whenever they'd visit us and would often bring me gifts. His siblings would only visit us sometimes and never all at once, so I did see a lot more of his family than he saw mine, but I was okay with that. I used to get along with my mother-in-law, Jean, 55, female. Initially, and even up until recently, we were on good terms. She was always nice to me, and I respected that, so I didn't expect her to turn out to be one of the nightmare mother-in-laws that I've read about right here on Reddit. But unfortunately, that's exactly how she turned out to be. Her true colors began to show once Jake and I got engaged about 8 months ago. He'd arranged for both our families to be present when he proposed to me, and it was one of the happiest days of my life. Now it's definitely my wedding day. We went out for dinner with our families afterward, and while we were talking, Jean mentioned that she was really looking forward to having us move back home with them now. Neither Jake nor I knew what she was talking about because we certainly didn't intend on moving to Iowa. We were very happy with our life here in Philly and didn't intend on going anywhere for a while. I don't know why, but for some reason Jean had just assumed that we'd move to Iowa after we got married and help out with running the farm and the business. I think it was probably because all her other kids had chosen the farm life and lived with her, but Jake had made it very clear that he preferred this life and had no intention of living with his parents. Not to mention that he knew the farming business would be in good hands even after his dad, Ben, 57, male, chose to retire because Jared would be there to take over. Jared had married one of their neighbors and lived on the farm. Alex hadn't married and Kelly was still too young. She just graduated and was trying her luck at graphic designing while working from home. It wasn't as if his parents were all on their own and absolutely needed him to come back home. We didn't say anything at dinner, but after we got back home, I asked Jake about what his mother had said, and he reassured me that he had no interest in going back and would communicate that to his mother the very next day. He didn't say anything at dinner because he didn't want to bring down the energy of that evening. The next day, he went over to the hotel his family was staying in to speak to his mom about this and came back in a very bad mood. When I asked him about it, he told me that his mother hadn't taken that news well, and after one point, she started blaming me for his decision. She believed that I was the one who had influenced his decision and was preventing her son from moving back home to live with her, and had also spoken a lot of rubbish about me and my family, which is why they'd had a really bad argument. And even my father-in-law, Ben, had decided to stand up for me, which had just made things worse. Jared and his wife agreed with Jean and believed that Jake and I should move back after we got married, but Ben, Alex, and Kelly believed that we were free to do whatever we wanted to. We'd worked hard to build a life for ourselves here in Philly, and we wanted to live life on our own terms. There was nothing wrong with that. Jean thought that my husband was betraying her family and putting me before them, even though I had nothing to do with his decision. He'd just never shown any interest in wanting to move back home, and neither had I encouraged it. She said a bunch of things about me back then during their argument that I didn't like. And after Jake told me about it, I decided that I wasn't going to speak to her anymore unless she apologized for it. She hadn't said it to me to my face, but even then it didn't feel fair since most of the things she'd said weren't even true. I'm not mentioning it here because it's not relevant and I'm trying to keep this short right now. It wasn't like she'd called me something unforgivable, but it was just petty and annoying to hear that she'd said these things. So after that, I decided to distance myself from her, and we barely even spoke for the next couple of months. I was also really busy with wedding prep, so I didn't have the time to think about these things either. When the time came, we did invite both his parents and the rest of his family, even though Jean and Jared had been very distant after the whole debate about where we'd live after marriage, and surprisingly, they did agree to attend. After they'd received the invites, Jean even called me and apologized for whatever she'd said, and told me that she'd been acting out because she'd been going through some issues in her personal life, and she'd taken things way too far because of that. I forgave her because I wanted my wedding to be a happy one, and the way to achieve that was to be on good terms with the most important guests, our families. She also seemed very genuine with her apology and explained that she'd been going through a rough patch with her husband and she'd been very moody, which is why she'd overreacted. She didn't explain what was going on with Ben, and I didn't ask further because I didn't want to pry, so that was it. We remained in touch during the next couple of weeks leading up to the wedding, and it felt like everything was all right again. Even on the day of our wedding, she was very nice to me, and the ceremony went beautifully. It was only after the ceremony and speeches that I realized Jean was suddenly nowhere to be seen. I had to get changed out of my wedding dress into something more comfortable for the reception anyway, so I decided to leave the venue for a bit and also look for Jean because I had a feeling she was up to no good. The reception was being held in the hotel itself, and before going up to my room to change, my maids of honor and I decided to stop by the room the reception was to be held in. To our horror, we found Jean inside, and she was absolutely destroying the room by throwing around feathers like confetti all around the room. She definitely bribed some employee to let her in and was then trying to ruin my wedding with a reminder of the farm for Jake to feel guilty about. My friend and I were shocked and didn't know how to react for the first few seconds because she had an entire plastic bag full of feathers that she was emptying on the floor. Not only was it a hazard to walk around in because anyone could skid on those and fall, but it was also a health hazard since people were supposed to have dinner in that room. I was stunned, but after I recovered from the shock of what I was seeing, I decided to start recording it because she literally looked insane and malicious to the core while she was trying her very best to ruin my wedding. She'd already covered half of the floor with the feathers and was getting to the other half slowly, so it was pointless to try and stop her. But I did some quick thinking and whipped out my phone to make sure I had proof of her acting psychotic. She had her back turned to us the entire time, so she couldn't see us, but we could easily record her with her face in it. And after recording for a minute and a half, I decided that I'd seen enough. And now it was time to do some damage control. I wasn't going to let her succeed and ruin my wedding, but neither did I want to confront her today and ruin Jake's day. So my maid of honor and I decided to speak to the manager of the hotel and ratted Jean out. He was kind enough to understand my situation and told us that we could use the other room to host a reception, but it was a little smaller and they'd need an extra hour to decorate it as well. We pulled out the security footage and he told us that the employee who'd let Jean into the room would be fired, and he even offered to have security throw her out, but I told him that there was no need for that. I didn't want any fuss on my wedding day. We'd already paid for the room in advance, but the manager was nice enough to let us have the other room for free, since it was an employee of the hotel who was also involved in this mess. We thanked him. I called Jake and told him to wait with the guests at the venue for about an hour more while they prepared the reception room for dinner. I made up some excuse as to why the place wasn't prepared yet, but didn't tell him the real reason. After explaining to him that we had to push the reception, I changed into my dress for the reception, and my maid of honor and I oversaw the decorations and even helped to speed up the process. We were done within 45 minutes and were ready to have the guests over. I'd spoken to the manager and we'd only started decorating the other room after Jean had left the hotel premises to head back to the venue, and she had no idea that her pathetic plan to ruin my wedding day had flopped miserably. Once she arrived, along with the other guests, she looked at me and smiled warmly. But that smile was wiped off her face as soon as she realized that the guests were being led towards a different room than the one she'd trashed, and I swear I'd never felt as vindicated as I did in that moment. The rest of the evening went without a hitch, and Jean even congratulated me before she left because she had no idea that I knew what she tried to do. After 2 days had passed, I finally decided to tell Jake, and for good measure, I also sent that video to Ben right before I spoke to him. What Jake would tell his mother was his business, but I wasn't going to let her get away either, and this was my way of getting back at her. I knew that they'd been having problems in their marriage since she'd told me about it earlier, and if there was even a slight chance that I could make it worse for her, I sure would do it without second thoughts. So after I sent that video to my father-in-law, I talked to Jake and filled him in on everything that had happened on the day of our wedding. I also told him that I'd already sent the video to Ben because I didn't want to keep him in the dark about anything. Truly, I had no idea how he was going to react, but to my pleasant surprise, he was quite supportive and told me I did the right thing. He was also really thankful that I'd tried so hard to hide this all from him so I wouldn't ruin his day, and said that it meant the world to me. So this didn't cause any problems in our marriage like Jean had intended, because Jake was more than okay with what I'd done. But she sure did end up ruining her own marriage by trying to sabotage our wedding day. After I sent the video to Ben, he replied to me a couple of hours later and thanked me, but didn't say much else, which felt kind of underwhelming. But then Jean called Jake and started shouting at him about what I'd done to ruin her marriage. Apparently, the trouble that she'd been having in her marriage had a lot to do with the farm, which she wasn't willing to give up. Ben had received an offer to sell the farm about a year ago, and it was a pretty hefty amount that was being offered, so it was hard to say no. He had no intention of continuing farming for the rest of his life, and his kids, with the exception of Jared and his wife, weren't interested in the farm life either. He'd planned to sell the farm off and split the money between himself and all his kids so that then they could move to the city and live closer to us. But Jean had shut that idea down quickly since she didn't like the idea of leaving their farm and home. The buyer didn't back off and kept increasing the amount gradually, and even now the offer still stands. That's what they'd been fighting about for so long, because Ben was ready to say goodbye to the farm. But Jean wasn't, and things had gotten to a point where Ben and Jean were sleeping in separate rooms since they couldn't even talk to each other without it turning into a fight anymore. Things were bad enough as it is, and my video had just escalated their conflict, because now Ben had decided to file for divorce and had packed his stuff up and left their house after fighting with both Jean and Jared. He's told Jean that he isn't coming back because she's absolutely unhinged, and the farm has become such a point of contention for her that she's willing to go to any length, so he can't bring himself to trust her anymore now. Jake told her that it was her own fault that her husband had decided to leave, and there was nothing he could do to fix the situation at that point. Jean then decided that she was now going to start pushing Jake to file for divorce from me instead, since apparently I was the one who was destroying his home and tearing him away from his family through my selfishness. Jake fought with his mother about that on that day and said a lot of horrible things to her, and even called her a psycho and an obsessive weirdo. I'd never seen him that angry, and after they disconnected the call, I had to spend several hours consoling him. Even after that, she's continued to text him and keeps insisting that he needs to divorce me if he wants to be happy in the future, or else I'll end up ruining his life. It's been 4 days now, and yesterday she messaged me saying that I had destroyed her home. She told me that she just tried to pull a silly little prank to mess with me, but I'd blown it all out of proportion, and now her marriage had gone to absolute ruin. I tried to ignore her, but she then sent me a picture of divorce papers and asked me if I was pleased with myself. I just couldn't hold back, so I replied, yes, and then blocked her. It was less out of anger, but more out of spite, because it wasn't me who had originally tried to mess up her marriage. But she definitely had gone out of her way to ruin what was supposed to be a joyous day for me and her son, only because I didn't want to move back to the farm, and neither did her son. She was ready to penalize us for something that wasn't even our fault, and now she's mad that the consequences of her actions are finally catching up to her. So I didn't feel particularly bad about saying that I was happy she was getting divorced. But then this morning, Jake told me that she, Jared, and his wife were not throwing a fit over what I'd said. And while he didn't scold me for it, he did say that he wished I just ignored her instead of replying and making matters worse. He seemed a little miffed about what I'd done, and I did apologize. But he just grunted in response to it and said that what I did was really quite unnecessary, but now it was done and there was no changing it. I don't know how to feel about the situation now, because I do see his point, but I feel like we also should remember that Jean was the one who started it all, and not me. Her putting all the blame on me and provoking me should have been enough for anyone to snap at her. But Jake also has a point. AITA for telling my mother-in-law that I'm happy that her husband has filed for divorce after she tried to sabotage my wedding, and then tried to force my husband to leave me after I exposed her attempt to sabotage? Update 1. Hey everyone, thanks for all the advice here, and especially those who were extra kind and supportive. I don't have anything against farmers, but that's not the lifestyle I'm used to. Just to be clear, because some of you all were accusing me of trying to be offensive towards farmers. I have the utmost respect for them, but that's just not my comfort zone, and I think that's okay. Also, a few people wanted to know what exactly my mother-in-law had said about me initially after Jake and I got engaged, which I didn't include in the original post because I didn't find it relevant. So here goes. She said that I had no family values because I'd never had any siblings or any proper family, which is why I was encouraging Jake to abandon his family, and said that I hadn't been raised right, which I didn't like. She also called me selfish and untrustworthy and said that our marriage wouldn't last long, so you can see why I didn't want to speak to her. I should have stuck to my decision later on as well, but we all make mistakes, and so did I. Jake and I are doing well now. He's moved on from what I texted his mom because he thinks that she brought it on herself. We talked about it last evening itself after he came back home from work, and he told me that he didn't care about that anymore and apologized for being upset with me over something like this, when I had every right to hit back at Jean after what she'd done. So we made it up the same day, and now it's all fine between us. I can't say the same for my in-laws, though, because Alex and Kelly have decided to move out of the house in protest and are living with their dad in a hotel right now while Jean, Jared, and his wife handle the farm. Realistically speaking, I don't think she'll get to keep the farm, and eventually they'll have to sell it because after watching that video, I highly doubt any judge in their right mind would rule in her favor. Jake and I are on Ben's side and have told him and his siblings that they can talk to us anytime they need to and ask us for whatever help they want, and we'll be there. Ben doesn't even seem upset anymore, and he's become much more lively than he was at the wedding. But I think shedding a deadweight spouse does that to people. I'm happy for him because I honestly cannot imagine spending a lifetime with Jean, and he's someone who has managed to cover half of one lifetime with her. So kudos to him for that. I really hope the divorce works out well. Update 2. Hey, I didn't think I'd be back so soon, but unfortunately here I am. Not with good news, I'm afraid. Jared had to be rushed to the hospital 2 days back because he'd been hit in the arm by one of the cow's horns, and the injury was really bad. It was usually Ben who would deal with the cattle while Jared and Jean would take care of the production and financial aspects, so they weren't used to the more hands-on things, and neither did they have the years of experience that Ben did. I can't blame Ben either, because he told his wife and son time and again that they were not supposed to mess with the animals when he was not around. And even though he was getting divorced, he'd make sure to come home 3 times a week to take care of the animals. On the days he was too tired to come, he'd send Alex, who also had more experience than Jared. Only Alex and Ben had the proper training because the other kids, including my husband, had never shown an interest in hanging out with the animals. Even the buyer had been willing to have the handlers be trained by Ben and Alex once they take over, but Jared, for whatever reason, thought that he knew better and tried to take matters into his own hands, which is what landed him in the hospital. It's only been 10 days since the last update, and I'd really thought that I'd only come back when I had good news to share about the divorce, but apparently not. We're all in Iowa now and have visited Jared already, but he's too exhausted to even talk to us for more than 15 minutes at a stretch. The medicines are doing their job and he'll get better eventually, but his wife is inconsolable. One would think that at least now Jean would start thinking about an alternative lifestyle, right? Since they were not cut out for the job. But no, she's still hell-bent on retaining the farm and not selling. And that had led to another huge fight right in the hospital parking lot last evening when Ben and Jean came face to face. He called her an idiot of the highest degree and even said that she was not only a selfish wife, but was proving to be a bad mother now, since she didn't even care that her son wasn't up for the job the way she'd believed and had even been hurt in the process. And yet she was still not willing to keep her ego aside even for a second. It had gone on for a while, but finally Jake and I had managed to separate the two of them and took Ben back to the hotel, where he ranted about Jean for the next hour and a half while drinking scotch. So that's how things are right now. This definitely will affect the divorce, but I hope it's in Ben's favor. Update 3. Hello, so it's been quite a few months since I updated you guys on what happened, and it's about time that I came back here to talk about it. But first things first, thank you to everyone who sent us good wishes and prayed for Jared. He's healed well and is doing much better, even though he occasionally has trouble with his arm. They're also expecting their first kid, and well, so are Jake and I. I guess I'll just have all the good news out of the way before I move on to the divorce bit. I'm 6 weeks in and she's crossed the 3-month mark already. It's pretty exciting since they've moved 2 blocks away from where Jake and I live currently. It's been nice so far, and even Ben, Alex, and Kelly live in the vicinity, but not as close as Jared and his wife. It's been 3 months since the divorce came through and 1 month since they've all come back to live here. As you guys may have guessed by now, my in-laws ended up selling their farm and property for an exorbitant price, and most of them have moved here. Jean chose to remain in Iowa, but nobody's too worried since she can easily afford to live out of the rest of her life there by herself, and even hire a companion if she wants to. Jared told us that he'd offered to bring her along, but she'd rebuffed him and called him a traitor for even thinking about abandoning her this way. He couldn't help the situation anymore, but at least he tried. The divorce was messy, and Ben and Jean are probably never going to be on speaking terms ever again, which would be really weird at Jared's wife's baby shower, since he'll definitely invite his mom. She might not come, though, since she's been very quiet and distant ever since the divorce. Jake and I haven't tried to reach out to her, but the other kids have, and she mostly only replies with either 1 or 2 words at most, or just chooses to ignore their attempts to contact her. We know she's still well and alive from her cryptic Facebook posts, which she shares every hour. It's usually either selfies of her hanging out with her group of friends playing bingo or drinking wine with captions about how she's better off without a toxic family now, or otherwise it's quotes about being the black sheep or being the wisest one. You know the stuff. The ones in calligraphic font in white on a black background. So that's her entire feed, and also the way we know she's still okay. Jake and I have never been better in our personal lives because a baby is all that we need to complete our family. And it's finally happening. I'm super pumped to start this new chapter of our lives, and so is he. I wish us luck, and let's hope things only get better now. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl